I'm the Director of International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute, and I have brought with me a petition signed by over 20,000 Australians calling for a parliamentary inquiry into the AUKUS deal. Polling by the Australia Institute shows that 66% of Australians would support a parliamentary inquiry into the AUKUS deal, so we believe that it is time for the Parliament to do its job. The UK has had an inquiry into AUKUS. The US is currently holding its own inquiry into AUKUS. Australia, meanwhile, which bears the brunt of the cost and the risk of this deal, hasn't had an inquiry. And in a healthy democracy, scrutiny of this deal, which will be the biggest international transfer of wealth in Australia's history, should be welcomed.
Thanks very much, Emma. And I want to thank the Australia Institute for the work they're doing in trying to get transparency on AUKUS. In the last week, we've seen Australia pretend that a relationship with the United Kingdom can A, keep us safe in the Asia-Pacific region, and B, deliver AUKUS nuclear submarines. Both of those assumptions are plainly false. The UK's had an inquiry into AUKUS, and strangely enough, they quite like a deal which sees some $40 billion of Australian money funneled into UK industry over the next 2 decades. The US is in the middle of a review instituted by Donald Trump, which millions of Australians are hoping will see AUKUS cancelled. Meanwhile, the Albanese government, with the tacit support of the coalition, is refusing even to undertake a review of AUKUS. And what's remarkable about AUKUS is it was signed up without even a formal cabinet brief. It was signed up without any kind of serious scrutiny, either from within Defence or within the Parliament. We are now 3 years on into this failed project. We see time and time again the warning signs telling the Australian public, telling the Australian government, if they'll listen, that AUKUS will fail. It's a question of when and how much it will cost us. In the last 24 hours, we've seen one of the most senior US admirals admit that the first part of AUKUS can't get out the gate unless the United States doubles its submarine production. And to be clear, there are no viable strategies for that to happen in the United States. Now, I am certain, the Greens are certain, that the Trump administration, for all its erraticism, for all its chaos, will at least be getting that kind of clear evidence from its own Navy and from its own US Defence Department. So what is it that the Albanese government is frightened of? What is it that the coalition is frightened of when it comes to an AUKUS inquiry? The Greens have placed a motion on the federal parliament's books for a the Greens have placed a motion on the parliamentary books for a select committee into AUKUS, not dominated by either the coalition or Labor, but which fairly represents a cross-section of the parliament. And we are calling on the Albanese government to show some courage, to support an independent parliamentary inquiry, which we know is supported by some 2/3 of the Australian public. Let's have the inquiry. Let's hear from the public. Let's hear from the key stakeholders. Let's hear from people who know that the creaks and the leakage that's happening within the Defence Department can finally come forward. We know that if we put the blowtorch on AUKUS, if we ask for submissions from the public, if we properly interrogate the Defence Department and defence officials, that it's likely to show that this is a $375 billion folly. So why don't we get out before we waste tens more billions of dollars? This motion is on the books today. We can already see Labor trying to come up with parliamentary strategies to avoid it coming onto a vote. The Greens are committed to keeping it on the books until we have the numbers to support this AUKUS inquiry. And with millions of Australians behind us, we know that day will come soon. Any questions?
Senator, do you believe we'll ever see a Virginia-class submarine come to us from America despite all the money we're sending?
Well, the only Virginia-class submarines we're going to see coming from the US are going to have a shiny US flag on it at a nuclear submarine base built by Australian taxpayers at Fremantle. You only have to listen to what the US Navy is telling Congress. The US Navy is telling Congress they will not have any spare nuclear submarines. Why is it that those messages are not being heard by Anthony Albanese and Richard Marles? It's not just the Greens who are saying that there won't be any nuclear submarines. The core decision makers inside the United States Pentagon are saying the same thing. Emma, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. Look, I'd say even if the United States shipbuilding industry made it to the targets that it needs to, the legislation is really clear that the president has final say and has no obligation to hand those submarines over to Australia. And I think it's incredibly unlikely that if a president were to do that, they wouldn't come with conditions. So that really means that, as David has outlined, the AUKUS deal is rife with risk of failure, but there are also significant risks if it succeeds for Australian sovereignty and for the ability of future Australian governments to make independent decisions.
Yeah. A number of critical observers from the US perspective are saying that the AUKUS deal is going to embed thousands of Australian sailors inside the US Navy. The estimate is that some 10% of the Virginia crews inside the US Navy will be Australian personnel. The US are asking themselves, well, what kind of sovereign risk does that mean for the United States? If there's a war with Taiwan, if there's a war over Taiwan, will the Australian government be able to recall Australian personnel? The US are also saying they haven't got enough submarines for their own purposes. So who would hand over a scarce resource to Australia unless there was a rock-solid guarantee that Australia would use it in whichever conflict the US are proposing? I'm hopeful that our government won't hand that kind of guarantee over to the United States, won't surrender our sovereignty and say Australian troops inside Virginia-class submarines and any future Australian submarines will not automatically be used in a US war. If Donald Trump and the Pentagon hear that, the likelihood of us receiving any nuclear submarines diminishes even further.
Are you hearing from any Labor colleagues that they want to back this inquiry, or they would if they could?
Well, of course, you run into colleagues in the corridors and they say one thing, and it's pretty clear that the rank and file of the Labor Party is in revolt over AUKUS. And you couldn't be an effective Labor MP if you weren't hearing that revolt inside the Labor Party ranks. The question is, when will the dam wall break? When will we see a significant number of Labor MPs come across to back this inquiry? It's a question of when, not if.
Can I just add as well that the Victorian State Labor Conference is on the weekend and there'll be a motion there on the floor to have AUKUS removed from the National Party platform. So this is not an issue that's going away from the party. I think the backbench and the rank and file are rightly really deeply concerned about the deal and the risks that David has outlined.
Yeah.
Senator, just one more on a different topic. The UN climate chief is here to see Chris Bowen today over our 2035 targets. What's the Greens' view on that target? What should it be?
Well, we've said very clearly that we need some of the strongest targets. Australia, being the second largest fossil fuel exporter on the planet, needs to be showing global leadership. We have a government that we're very fearful will have some of the weakest targets for 2035. We know what the UN is saying. The UN is saying coal and gas needs to be kept in the ground and we can't be digging it up and exporting it after 2035. We need targets that will say Australia will stop being part of the global problem on climate and by 2035 be keeping its coal and gas in the ground.
Do you think the chief's warning that fruit might become a once-in-a-year treat is a bit overblown, or do you think that's realistic where things might go if climate change isn't happening?
We're already seeing the feedback loop happening from the climate change that's been fed into the system. We're already seeing winters becoming increasingly unpredictable, record droughts, record floods, record heat waves. When the UN is warning that things like fruit might become a rare, occasional luxury, well, I think the world should be listening. Thanks very much.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.